Hello, my name is Chase Alexander Jordal, and I would like to talk to you briefly about mandatory military service or conscription. First, a little bit about me. I have a master's in political science. I work as a teacher. I am a lieutenant in the Norwegian Home Guard, and I am also a local politician. Um, but the subject of mandatory military service is something which has been talked about more and more in recent years. We've seen it in Ukraine and in Russia, the process of training your people in order to be able to defend your country, and also calling on said people to take up arms in defense of the country, was once something in very recent years we thought belonged to the past, but which we now see is much more of a hot topic today than it has been in quite a long time. But first, what is mandatory military service? Well, the process of forcing people into military service is something which has existed for quite a long time. Um, either it be either it be people who were the Ottoman Empire went around kidnapping Hungarians and forcing them into military service, or the process of lords taking peasants to do the same. But around the French Revolution, the whole idea of a national military service started to arise. France needed to defend itself as a nation against enemies of the revolution, and they managed to mobilize enormous groups of civilians in defense of the country, the patria, the homeland. And this allowed France to mobilize large armies of regular people who were given basic military training and then worked as soldiers and were sent to defend the country. And this eventually became the standard, which more or less every European nation adopted throughout the 19th century and until both World Wars, and also into the Cold War. But after the Cold War ended, the need for large, what we call mobilizing militaries dissipated. NATO was standing there with its old enemy, the Soviet Union, all of a sudden gone. And the question, what are we going to do with NATO and these large militaries we've built up, arose. Militaries are very expensive to keep going, and especially militaries which are based on conscription, where you have to take thousands of young people every year and train them up from the bottom, from nothing, into soldiers, year by year. That costs quite a lot to sustain. And with the end of the Cold War, the end of history, people didn't see the need for this anymore. So state after state started cutting military spending. Many got rid of conscription altogether, but some did not. And now, today, with the war in the Ukraine, we are again seeing countries start to rearm, to talk about reinstigating military service or mandatory military service. And more and more countries are using more money on building up their militaries. But what is conscription in of itself? To the baseline, it is a process where the state uses money and time and trains individual citizens in the arts of war and other important things as well, like first aid and survival techniques, turns them into soldiers, usually through a process of up to a year. And then, after they have gotten their education, they go back to civilian life and can be called in for military exercises or mobilized in case of a conflict. But I believe personally that conscription is a good thing, and it is good for both society in its whole and for the individual. We can start with, why is it good for society? Well, when large amounts of the populace in the country receive military training, they learn survival techniques, they learn first aid skills, they become more prepared as individuals. If you're in a society where almost everyone has some experience with medical issues, let's say first aid, or also just tackling very stressful situations which are created on purpose in the military, the people in the society become more resilient and more and better capable of handling both catastrophes and unexpected things, but also things that can happen to them individually. Furthermore, a nation whose military is first and foremost based on conscription, well, on the one side, its military becomes a little bit slower to act. It's harder to move military forces around quickly. You have to mobilize them first and have to get them into working order. But it also makes fighting unpopular wars much more difficult. And this is something the United States learned with the Vietnam War, which was at a time when the United States had conscription or the draft, and they saw massive protests against the war. And it's quite a different thing when you're fighting a conflict overseas, and that's an important issue, an overseas conflict, and you're using people who are forced into military service versus using volunteers. And this is something I believe the United States learned quite clearly after the Vietnam War, where they obviously went away from the draft and from conscription and towards a completely professionalized army. Professional armies have, of course, good sides and downsides to them. On the upside, you can train people much better than the regular conscript. You can have a higher professional standard in your military. It's easier to act, you can easily deploy it. But on the negative side, if you train a group of people in the art of war, and that is their main job, of course they want to, test out or actually use their skills, be much more eager to use them in foreign conflicts. And for politicians, it's much easier to send professional soldiers who've signed up for this and know what they're going to do to military conflicts than conscripts. It's even easier to, of course, use mercenaries, which is something that some of the larger countries are rediscovering as well. But when it's a military or a military based on mandatory military service, it costs the economy more to take large numbers of people out of their regular lives and put them into the military. And it makes it much more difficult to act aggressively or participate in foreign conflicts. But I would say that another important thing, of course, is that if you have a well-functioning mandatory military service, you have a system where people, they finish high school, and then 1 year in the military, or shorter, becomes almost like a natural continuation of the basic education. People are taken in there. They meet people from all across the country, different cultures, different classes. I have worked as a sergeant in the Norwegian military, and I have had soldiers from all different social classes. And it's very interesting, and subcultures, and they come in, shave their heads, they put on their uniforms, and they become uniform. They become one group. And you see people who would probably never talk to each other because of social class or grouping, all of a sudden become best friends. And they learn to work together because they're forced to work together. And they have to work together to overcome larger obstacles. So the whole idea of mandatory military service, it can strengthen the nation and the society, but also the individual. I'll shortly get back to why it's good for the individual. But a good thing about the mandatory military service from a societal perspective is it gives the people an arena where they are pushed out of their comfort zone and more or less have to grow quite a bit as people. Something that you can't do in schools anymore, but it's something that people really have, it's really good for them to be pushed and to be expected more of, and to be made to leave their comfort zone and discover that where they think their limits are, they can do quite a bit more. And the more people who have been through said processes, the better it is for society as a whole, because you will get a better quality of people. But why is it good for the individual then? Well, it goes back to, again, some of the things I've already said. I can personally say that with the things I have done in the Norwegian military, I was there for a few years. I was a conscript. Having been conscripted into the military, doing my 1 year of national service, I discovered that I quite liked the military, and this was something I might want to do as a career. So I took an NCO course and stayed on for a few years and learned quite a bit about myself. But with the things I've done in the military, I can honestly say there is just about nothing as difficult or challenging in civilian life as compared to what I've done in the military. So whenever I'm in a tough predicament, I can always think back to what I've done in the forests of Norway or up along the Norwegian-Russian border while skiing for weeks on end, that I can do this and I can probably do more than this. And that gives me a type of inner strength, which I know I have definitely had use for. Also, it gives people all sorts of new experiences. One thing is that when you come into military service, you meet people from all across the country, all walks of life, and your experience with the nation grows. You get to know people from all over, up and down social hierarchy, and you learn, well, quite a bit about them as well. Furthermore, mandatory military service, I would say that it helps the individual grow as a person, especially when you're talking about an 18, 19-year-old who's been living at home their entire lives, walking around tugging on mommy's skirt. All of a sudden, they're taken far away from home. They're sent to some camp up in, a god-awful place in northern Norway where nobody lives. And they're forced to survive on their own. They're forced to, again, leave their comfort zones and do things they never expected that, to have done. And I've seen so many people grow immensely with that 1 year of service, where they come in and they're completely dependent on other people, their parents, whatnot, to being pushed out of their comfort zone, to understanding that they can do more than they think they can do. In Norwegian, we call that mestring, or mastering, achieving, or just pushing your boundaries, and understanding that you have more in you than you thought you did. And that is an experience that literally just about everyone should have, I say. And it is good for just about everyone. And as a teacher today, I very often see pupils who I know should probably be pushed a bit further than they get pushed in school. And if they go into the military, I am very certain that they will get the good experiences that come with said service. When it comes to mandatory military service today, there are not many countries who still have it in the Western world. There are some: Norway, Sweden, Finland, Israel. Norway is in the interesting situation where we have it for both men and for women. I believe also the situation in Israel, but not many other countries. But we really don't have a truly mandatory military service, because out of let's say, the amount of people born in a year in Norway is about 60,000. And it's only about 8 to 10,000 of them, men and women, who actually have a military service. So a very small group. Back in the 90s, I believe it was just about maybe 25 or 30,000, and that was just men, so practically everyone. But it is a type of experience which it helps people grow as individuals. It is good for society. And from a slightly more philosophical position, I would say it strengthens the position of the citizen in opposition to the government. Because when the government, out of its own self-interest, it's, the interest of defending the nation, uses time and money to train its populace how to use weapons and basic tactics, it indirectly gives quite a lot of power to the citizens. How so? Well, it's quite an American thing, but just think about a country where the populace knows how to use arms and also has more access to them than a country where that's not the situation. You will find people who are harder to oppress or harder to take rights away from, because the people know how to defend themselves. So in a way, when a government or a state uses time, money, and resources on training its populace, it both strengthens itself, strengthens the populace because of the good experiences which military service gives, and it also truly strengthens the citizens in their position, because the citizen is expected to defend the country, is expected to be capable of doing so, and in so doing also is capable of defending his or her own rights. So I am personally quite in favor of mandatory military service. I think more countries should have it. Also the United States. being as the United States. If it wasn't that it was a global empire and needed to defend its interests overseas and quickly be able to put boots on the ground and everywhere from Mogadishu to Germany, it could have a much smaller military than it does today. And that military could be conscription based and focus in a way that it was based on defending the country as opposed to being better fit for overseas action. But I'm glad that Norway has mandatory military service. If you have any questions about what mandatory military service is like in Norway, feel free to send me a message or write down below, and I'll gladly make another video on this topic if you find it interesting. I'll also be glad to share some more stories from my own time in the Norwegian Army.